Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's me. It's Stevie Stroh, the original gamer, and I'm making this video for Throwback Thursday. And what are we going to be talking about today? Well, in the little picture you see behind me here, you are seeing some Dungeons and Dragons old school manuals. So what are we going to talk about? It's Throwback Thursday. We want to talk about some old school stuff. So I want to talk about the original role-playing game that I played as a kid and how that inspired me to want to get into computers to be able to play text adventures, and how those text adventures graduated into graphics adventures and dungeon crawlers. And I think they all have certain things in common, certain inspirations, and so I want to talk about some of them. So I've been asked by people who watch me play games on YouTube, do you play any RPGs? What is an RPG? It's a role-playing game. Do you play any role-playing games on computers or consoles? And for the most part, my answer would be no. I don't. I don't for a couple of reasons. Number one, those games usually require a lot of time. I don't always have a lot of time. And also, more importantly, is that going back historically, going back to even the late 70s, and as long as I've been playing with computers and consoles and stuff, I haven't found too many RPGs that remind me of the original RPG that I played. What game was that? That was this game here. This game is called Dungeons and Dragons. It was released by TSR Games, that would later be called TSR Hobbies. It was written by, it's called the original adult fantasy role-playing game for 3 or more players, TSR Games. And so Dungeons and Dragons started off as almost the size of a magazine, but this was the rule book for the game. It was by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. This is the 1978 edition. This one was originally published in 1974. So Dungeons and Dragons has been around for a while. Probably one of the earliest games on computers were games that were known as adventure games, or what we would now call text adventure games, because it was all text. And Dungeons and Dragons was the same thing. And it's because I was starting to play Dungeons and Dragons by the time I was like maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. I had some friends that played it. They got me interested in it. That kind of got me into the computer as well. It was not only video games, but it was adventure games. So how did Dungeons and Dragons work? Well, there was, as you can see here, this is the game. The game is in a book. So how do you play a game that's in a book? Well, you have to use your imagination. You have to use your mind. Now, this was the original Dungeons and Dragons as it came out on this book. Dungeons and Dragons ultimately evolved into some really good hardbound books, which I have all my originals as well. So Dungeons and Dragons evolved into what was called Advanced D&D, or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And there was many more hardbound manuals because the rules got a lot more complicated and a lot more informative. But what I loved about these books, number one, it's a hardbound, it's a real book. Just a lot of good writing in the game, lots of cool artwork. All this artwork, all this fantasy artwork that was in here. The covers were works of art. So, you know, the Dungeons and Dragons manual, I mean, look at some of this artwork here. It's just absolutely insane. But this game told you how to play the game. The game had rules. It was called a role-playing game, so you assumed the role of a character. You picked a character. Your characters had different classes. And a lot of this was heavily inspired by Tolkien's Lord of the Rings type stuff. So you had a class. You could be a human. You could be an elf. You could be a dwarf. You could be a halfling. You could be a different class or different race. Then there were different roles. You could be a magician. You could be, or they call a wizard. You could be a fighter. You could be a, different classes, different races. All kinds. So you kind of took on the role of a character. Another thing you did was you had really cool dice like these. So you rolled different dice for your different stats and your probabilities. Like when you wanted to create your character, you rolled 3 sets of 6-sided dice and you came up with some of your attributes like your strength, your intelligence, your charisma. This helped build your character. As you play the game and you do battle and you win battle and you kill monsters and you get treasure, you get experience points and you add those up, and that helps you level up your character. Sound familiar if you played an RPG? So there was the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which had different manuals. So there was a Dungeon Master Guide. This was kind of like the main rule book. And then from the Dungeon Master Guide, there was a whole nother book that was called the monster manual. And the monster manual basically told you about a lot of different monsters you could put in your game. Again, just getting into the art, and this was all alphabetical, so it's almost like an encyclopedia of monsters. You got a picture of what they look like, you got all of their stats, what were their hit points, how much damage could they take, how much damage could they inflict, you know, so cool stuff. So this was the original monster manual. Well, later on we said, well, there's not enough monsters in the monster manual, so then they came up with another one called the Fiend Folio, and this was another one. Again, it's just an alphabetical encyclopedia of tons of bad guys you could put in your game. Something just fell out of this, so I'll have to find that. So you had the Fiend Folio. Again, hardbound book, really good, well-made book, lots of cool artwork. That then led to the Monster Manual 2 official. Now this one, TSR Hobbies, you know, the artwork got a little better, production got a little bit better. This was a newer one. This one came out, I don't know what year this came out. It says ages 10 and up. What was the year on this? A little bit later, 1982. So, you know, we went from like 74 to 78. This one was released in 82, so the TSR logo's a little bit better, you know, things like that. So you had all these books. How did the game play? Well, you had one person that controlled the game. That person was called the Dungeon Master. Dungeon Master basically would read off to you things. Now, the other thing is, too, is that, so those manuals, those led to, because the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, as the name implied, very complicated to learn and understand. So they released baby versions. They released the basic and the advanced set. These were like box sets, and you had all the rules, and you came with a set of dice, and it came with what was called a module. So, you know, how did the game work? Well, Dungeon Master controlled the game, and you either designed your own dungeon, you had to draw it out on graph paper, and you had to stock your dungeons and explain it to the people, or you could buy what was called a module. And a module was basically an adventure or a level. So this is one that came with the basic set. So with the module, part of this was a cover that you could kind of set up. If you were the Dungeon Master, you could set this up in front of yourself as a screen to kind of block your information. On the inside were some maps of the territory they had to explore. It was all done in graph paper, and then the players had a blank sheet of graph paper. You had to explain to them their location. So every time you walked into a new room, you say, well, you're in a room, and this room is 20 feet wide by 30 feet tall, and the walls go to the west and to the east, and you had to kind of explain the room that they were in. They would take a piece of graph paper, they would start drawing up the room like this, but the whole point of all this is you were using your imagination. So it was very much a game of the mind. There was nothing to see. You had to completely imagine who you were. You had to imagine where you were. You had to imagine the things you were fighting. And so a good dungeon master was kind of like a storyteller, and really set the mood. And so it was really a game that involved your imagination. And the best way I can explain playing Dungeons and Dragons was, it was like being involved in an interactive novel, an interactive story. Usually when you read a book, you have to paint everything in your mind. You have to paint, what does this world look like? What do these characters look like? You use your imagination to fill in what was only in words. Dungeons and Dragons was a game that played the same way. You had to use your imagination, and it really helped, you know, foster imagination and creativity in young minds. And so, you know, inside your manuals would be all kinds of information about all the different locations in here. And so the dungeon master would read this off depending on where the players move to on the map, and they roll their dice and they move and they do combat and they do all kinds of stuff. So if they walked into an area that was known as the Kobold's Lair, and this is what the Dungeon Master would be reading. There is a 2 in 6 chance that as the group enters a cave-like tunnel, 8 kobolds will come out from hiding in the trees above and attack. So the Dungeon Master would have to roll some dice, and so you know, you rolled a 6-sided dice, and if it was 2, then you rolled a 2, then you know what, then this event's going to happen, and you'd have to explain to them, oh, you just walked in here and 8 kobolds attack. It tells you the armor class of the kobolds, their hit dice, their hit points, their attack damage, what kind of treasure they were carrying, if you could keep it. So this was like a module, you know, and so you could buy these and have new adventures to play. If you did not have the time or the patience or just the imagination needed to create a new world, you could purchase those things. They were called modules. So other things that kind of came with that along the way, they sold all kinds of peripheral devices. Like this was a Dungeon Master's Adventure Log. This is where the Dungeon Master could keep track of things. You had to keep track of all this stuff on paper. So you had to keep track of hit points and experience points and treasure. So you had to write it all down and do like old school math in your head. Somewhere in here was another cool little item you could buy, and we usually just made these ourselves, but every now and then if you had a little bit extra money you could buy the fancy ones. This was called a player record sheet, and then this is where you could actually, of course now my green screen is not going to show this very well because it's actually on green paper, but this is where you could write down your character, all of their attributes, all of their modifiers, what you need to roll based on different armor classes. You could draw a picture of what your character looked like. On the back of this sheet, you could then write down magic items that you had acquired, normal items, leather armor, thieves' tools, other notes. This guy was a guy who successfully explored a certain castle, and he survived it, so you can hire him as a guide to the castle. These were some characters I created that were known as NPCs, or non-player characters, that you could bring into the world with you. What I actually had done was I started to create my own module. This one was called the Castle of Fear, and this guy here was a bad guy I created as the ultimate boss for this castle. He's kind of like half gorilla, half snake dude. He's like an evil demon dude. Here I'm indicating that there are werewolves in here, and there's some type of trick mirror you'd run into. So that was kind of the cover art for the module I was creating. This was the graph paper I used to actually build out my castle. I kind of drew the whole castle, and then you have to like put numbers in all your rooms. Then you have to go through a whole process that's known as stocking your dungeon, and you have to decide what type of bad guys will be in there, what kind of treasures in there. Are there hidden doors? Are there traps? Are there secret walls? You know, when people were playing Dungeons and Dragons, you would have a piece of blank graph paper, and you would be described how big a room was, and each one of these squares was a 10-foot by 10-foot square. So you'd say this room is 40 feet to the west and 30 feet to the south, and the people would start to draw things up, and so the players would build the map as they were discovering the world. So it was kind of cool, again, just all feeding on your imagination. So Dungeons and Dragons was a very cool game that I played as a kid. I want to say 10, 11, 12 years old. I was playing this game with a few friends. The cool thing about it was, again, you get to use your imagination. It's all fantasy setting. So if you're a fan of medieval type stuff, if you're a fan of like King Arthur, if you're a fan of any of the Lord of the Rings type stuff, fantasy stuff, dragons, knights, castles, dungeons, wizards, magic, if you like any of these things, which I was really into as a kid by reading comic books and reading Lord of the Rings, it was a cool way to enter that world and play the game. The only downside to this is that this required, typically at least they recommend at least 3 people. You need at least the dungeon master to control everything, and then at least 2 other players. You could play one person with the dungeon master. It's not as fun. It was really good when you had your party, and your party was consisted of all your friends. We weren't online. There wasn't an internet. We were all got together at somebody's house, and we played together around a table, and you're drinking Mountain Dews and, just staying up all night playing Dungeons and Dragons and just having a good time. I did this in junior high school, middle school. It was cool. And so that experience was something that I then realized I could have a scaled down version of this by playing what is known as a text adventure. So what is a text adventure? And the only ones that I played were the ones on my computer, which was the Radio Shack color computer. But you got a package like this. It came in a Ziploc bag. They were on a cassette, and this one was called Raqqa 2. There was another one that was called Pyramid. They had one called Madness in the Minotaur. But what you got, and this is looking a little bit distorted because of my green screen. With Raqqa 2, everything that's transparent now is actually green. But this was a text adventure game by Radio Shack. And when you flip through the pages here, again, you got a book, and the book explained things to you. Here's the introduction, right? So in here it says, you never thought that your PhD project would send you to a remote corner of the world, but the research grant came through. And you and your team of anthropologists began in India, sailing up the river Gangria or something, where it departs for the Ganges. Last night you entered Nepal on the river. You were forced to come around when navigation was simply impossible. But they kind of set the mood, right? And so I'm going to show you like what some of these things look like. And then there was actually inside here was a sheet you could tear open with, I guess, some answers. If you got really stuck, you could do things. But the way a text adventure kind of worked was it was all text. It was all just printed on the screen. All right, so here's a little video review of the text adventure game called Pyramid. You start off on a screen that just says, "Welcome to Pyramid." You hit enter. Okay. You are standing before the entrance of a pyramid. Around you is the desert. You could type in "look." You're standing before. So if I typed in "go south," you're in the desert, and I type in "look," you're in the desert. If I type in "north," I'm back to the entrance of the pyramid. I pretty much only have one option here, which is to enter pyramid, or maybe I just go north, Pyramid. I know, so if I go north, okay. You are in the entrance to the pyramid. A hole in the floor leads to a passage beneath the surface. There is a shiny brass lamp nearby. There is food here, there is a bottle here, there is water in the bottle. So I could type in "get lamp." Okay, get food, get bottle, or get B-O-T-T-L-E. You got to spell it right. Now if I type in inventory, it would tell me what I have. You're carrying a brass lantern, you're carrying tasty food, a small bottle. So if I say "look at lantern," look lantern. What? Look at lantern. Why am I getting this up here? Look at lantern. What do you want me to do with the lantern? Is it examine lantern? All right. You could do rub lamp. Rubbing the electric lamp is not particularly rewarding. Anyway, nothing exciting happens. Okay. Look bottle. Never mind. It's just saying look, right? So you're in the entrance to the pyramid. A hole in the floor leads to a passage beneath the surface. So if I say "go hole," enter hole. Climb down. Okay. You're in a small chamber beneath a hole from the surface. A low crawl leads inward to the west. Hieroglyphics on the wall translate "curse all who enter this sacred crypt." So my only entrance right now is to the west. I would type in "go west." It is now pitch dark. If you proceed, you will likely fall into a pit. So use lamp. Okay. Light lamp. Your lamp is now on. Now when I type in "look," you are crawling over pebbles in a low passage. There is a dim light to the east end of the passage. There is a small statue box discarded nearby. Get box. Examine box. Look at box. Or is it open box? Open box. I don't know how to lock or unlock such a thing. Okay. So, you have to like work within what the game does. Okay, so there's a dim light at the east end of the passage. You're crawling over pebbles. Get pebble? No? Okay, so can I go west more? No. You're in a room filled with broken pottery shards of ancient Egyptian crafts. An awkward corridor leads upward and west. A 3-foot scepter with an ankh on the end lays nearby. Get S-C-E-P-T-E-R. Get scepter. If I type in inventory. Inventory. What do I have? You are currently holding the following: a brass lantern, a statue box, a scepter, tasty food, small bottle, water in the bottle. So as you can see here, the reason why they call it a text adventure is because it's all text. It's just words on the screen. It gives you some basic descriptions as to where you are, what you can see, which directions you can go, and you have to interact with this environment. So these were some of the earliest games I played on my color computer, and I specifically chose these type of games because they reminded me of the Dungeons and Dragons experience, where you have this whole interactive fiction thing going on, where you are part of a story, you're interacting with the story, you're using your imagination. You could still draw a map too on paper. You could draw a map as to where you're going and what items you found in these locations, because there's no pictures here, there's no graphics. You will get lost. So just a little peek at a text adventure called Pyramid, and in a bit we'll show you some graphics adventures. So I hope you enjoyed this one. That ultimately these text adventures would evolve into what we then called graphics adventures, and some of the early graphic adventures were kind of split screen. So the top half of the screen had a picture of where you were, and then the bottom half of the screen you still typed in all your text. So it was a hybrid. But this was one of the first ones that Tandy released. Their first graphic adventure was called The Sands of Egypt. Ironically, didn't we do a pyramid game before? Okay, You are lost in the desert. You see sand. This one actually shows you a compass of what's on your screen, telling you what directions you could go. So I could go N for north. And what's kind of cool here is that you actually have animation. You have the clouds kind of scrolling across, and as the desert's moving, it's kind of multi-plane. If I go north again, how many times can I go north? Okay, you're at the top of a cliff. You see nothing special. Well, if I go D for down. Okay, you're at the base of the cliff. You see nothing special. Well, if I go south, you see nothing special. Can I go south again? Okay, here's a rope. Okay, you see an old rope. When I type in get rope, it says as you pick up the old rope, it crumbles to dust and blows away. You notice, however, that it was made from braided palm fronds. You are thirsty. Here's a shovel. Okay, get shovel, right? And then you can type in dig. You found nothing. And go west again. You can start digging in random places. You're very thirsty. You need to get water at some point in time. So what you can see, oh, here's a snake. Kill snake. How? With shovel. Okay, you are lost in a desert. You see sand. You see snake oil. You are very thirsty. So it's kind of cool that the text adventures evolved into what we call graphic adventures. And graphic adventures, obviously, as you can see here, give us something visual. The holy grail of kind of taking the whole concept of Dungeons and Dragons with the mapping and the monsters and the exploring dungeons and mazes, that concept with the adventure game concept of typing in commands and everything else was kind of brought into what the color computer's holy grail was a game that was called Dungeons of Daggorath. Look, examine. Okay, wooden sword. Okay, pull right torch, PRT. Use right. Use my torch. Okay, now I can look. Pull left sword. I have a sword in my left hand. So what we're looking at here is a game called Dungeons of Daggorath. Dungeons of Daggorath is pretty much the holy grail of adventure games because it's fully graphical, it's three-dimensional. This is technically what we'd call a dungeon crawler. Again, it's not the first dungeon crawler ever invented, but it's the first one on the CoCo, and it's probably, if you poll many people, whether or not they're even fans of games, I believe most people find Dungeons of Daggorath to be one of their favorite color computer games. So what I'm doing now is I'm typing in A space R for attack right. You could abbreviate your commands. So there's a snake here. Every time I hit him, I see the exclamation points of me attacking him. You can see my heart is going up too. I just killed him. There's the explosion sound. The cool thing about this was there, you know, your heart was beating and told you the state of your health and everything else. If you type in look, if you type in examine, it would tell you what's in the room. Okay, so I think you could just use your arrow. Okay, attack right, attack right, attack right. Now the cool thing about this too is it actually had a type ahead buffer, so you could type like a fiend, but the problem was too is that you sometimes got lost in where you're going. So I think it was M for move, right? So I'm moving forward. Now this was a completely black and white monochrome game. It used the highest resolution mode of the computer. There were no extra colors here. There were no extra palettes here. And so in order to simulate TR for turn right, that's a dead end, TA for turn around. And I think some of these things that look like dead ends, see that little popping sound, I think that's a spider. You can hear the monsters. So this was a real-time game where the people attacked you in real time. The monsters were roaming the dungeon in real time. You are moving through a three-dimensional maze that is the dungeon. It did simulate darkness. It did simulate distance. Definitely did a good job of creating monsters in this world, and each monster had a distinct sound. I hear one of them now. I think that's the blob, that low frequency sound. Yeah, and that noise I just heard there, that's one of the knights, right? So each monster had its a distinct sound. And if you survive these monsters, they will sometimes drop items, better swords, shields, things like that. So that looks like a snake. You can kind of see him off from a distance, so he's small. So here comes another snake, right? You can hear by his sound. So a snake was following me. He's come across me now. Now I can attack. So there are bad guys behind the snake coming too. Now the cool thing about this is that nobody will enter your space if there's already a monster there. So with this snake here, the other bad guys will kind of stack up. Let's see, now I'm starting to fade out because my heart was beating so fast. I was taking so much damage. And I died. I hope you had as much fun watching this video as I had making it for you. And if you did, then do me a favor and smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. If you've got something you'd like to say, throw out a comment and let me hear it. I'd really appreciate it if you could share this video and my channel with your friends. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see y'all next time. Peace out, bye-bye, and long live the CoCo.